So the Prime Minister of Canada just declared the American egg industry doomed, not threatened, not under pressure, not facing challenges, doomed. His exact words, standing at a podium in Ottawa with the Canadian and provincial flags behind him, broadcast live to the entire world. The American egg industry in its current form cannot survive what is coming, and the United States has no one to blame but itself. A foreign leader, the leader of a country Americans have spent decades treating as polite, quiet, and economically subordinate, just stood on camera and told 330 million Americans that one of their most basic, most essential, most taken for granted food industries is finished. Donald Trump's response was not measured. It was not strategic. It was not the calculated countermove of a president managing a complex trade relationship. Within 2 hours, Trump posted a 6-part tirade calling Carney delusional, a failed banker playing prime minister, and a man who wouldn't know a chicken from a trade deal, and then threatened to impose a 200% tariff on every Canadian product entering the United States until Canada learns to respect the greatest economy in the history of the world. Warren Buffett said Trump's reaction was the most revealing part of the entire confrontation because leaders don't rage over threats that aren't real, and the violence of the response told the world everything it needed to know about the accuracy of the declaration. But it's what Carney said after Trump's outburst, 12 words delivered with a calm that made them devastating, that tells you this confrontation is already over, and America lost it before it started. When you hear why Carney made this declaration, what Canada actually controls in the North American egg supply chain that most Americans have never been told about, and what is already happening to egg prices in every grocery store in the country, you'll understand why this isn't a trade spat over breakfast food. This is the moment America discovered its food supply. Depends on a country it just tried to humiliate. And that discovery is going to cost every American household money they can see on their grocery receipt this month and every month after. Hit subscribe, because the egg crisis is not the end of this story. It is the very beginning. Let me take you through exactly what was said, because the language on both sides reveals more than either leader intended. Carney's declaration came during a formal economic address, not an off-the-cuff remark, not a response to a journalist question, not a social media post. It was prepared, scripted, and delivered with the precision of a man who had rehearsed every word and calculated every consequence. He said, for years, the United States has treated Canadian agricultural exports as a convenience, something that would always be available, always be affordable, always flow south, regardless of how this country was treated. That assumption is over. The actions my government is announcing today will fundamentally restructure North American agricultural trade, and the American egg industry, which depends on Canadian inputs, it has never bothered to secure through respectful partnership, will be the first to feel the consequences. The language is revealing a convenience, as though Canadian agriculture exists to serve American needs. Never bothered to secure through respectful partnership. A direct indictment of the assumption that Canadian cooperation could be taken for granted indefinitely. The first to feel the consequences, not the only, the first. The implication that eggs are the beginning of a broader restructuring that extends across the entire agricultural relationship. This was not an angry leader making threats. This was a calm leader announcing a strategy that had already been set in motion. And the word doomed wasn't hyperbole. It was a description of actions already taken. Trump's response arrived within 2 hours, and it revealed everything that Carney's composure had concealed. 6 posts in rapid succession. Carney is delusional. If he thinks Canada can threaten the United States over eggs, the American egg industry is the strongest in the world and doesn't need anything from Canada, we will put a 200% tariff on every Canadian product until they learn respect. Canada's economy would collapse without the United States in 1 week. Carney is a failed banker who got lucky in politics and now thinks he can lecture the greatest country in the history of the world. The eggs are fine. The industry is fine. Everything is fine. The escalation from dismissal to fury within 6 posts told the story more clearly than any policy analysis could. If the American egg industry were fine, the president wouldn't be posting about it 6 times in 2 hours at 11 at night. But here's what most Americans don't know about their own egg supply, and what Carney understood long before he made that declaration. The American egg industry looks self-sufficient from the outside. The United States produces over a 100 billion eggs per year. It has massive commercial operations across the Midwest and Southeast. It appears to be one of the few agricultural sectors where America needs nobody. That appearance is an illusion, and the illusion is about to cost American consumers more money than any tariff Trump has ever imposed. The American egg industry runs on Canadian inputs that are invisible to consumers but essential to production. Start with genetics. The breeding stock that produces America's commercial laying hens, the genetic lines that have been optimized over decades for egg production, disease resistance, and feed efficiency flows through a small number of companies, and the most critical of those operations are headquartered in Canada. The parent flocks, the grandparent flocks, the elite genetic lines that sit at the top of the entire breeding pyramid. A disruption at that level doesn't reduce egg production by 10%. It collapses the replacement pipeline entirely because you cannot produce the next generation of laying hens without the genetic stock that produces them, and you cannot replicate 60 years of selective breeding in 6 months or 6 years. Then there's feed. Canada is one of the largest exporters of feed-grade grains and oilseeds to the United States. Soybean meal, canola meal, feed wheat, feed barley, the raw materials that become chicken feed in American egg operations. American farmers can grow some of these inputs domestically, but not at the volume, the cost, or the protein content that Canadian exports provide, and certainly not on the timeline required to replace a supply that disappears overnight. The American egg industry's feed costs are calculated on the assumption of Canadian supply. Remove that assumption, and the cost structure of every commercial egg operation in the country changes, not by a small margin, but by a margin that makes profitable operations unprofitable and marginal operations impossible. Then there's the crisis multiplier that makes everything worse. Avian influenza. The United States has lost more than 100 million birds to avian influenza over the past 3 years, an agricultural shock without precedent in modern American history. Rebuilding those flocks is not a simple matter of time or scale. It depends on a tightly interwoven supply chain. Replacement chicks rely on elite breeding stock. Breeding stock depends on specialized genetic pipelines, and those pipelines are deeply integrated with Canadian systems. Beyond genetics, the pharmaceutical backbone of poultry health vaccines, veterinary biologics, and disease management protocols also flows through Canadian research institutions and manufacturing networks that serve the entire North American market. In other words, the American egg industry is not merely connected to Canada during normal operations. It is structurally dependent on Canada for recovery in moments of crisis. Against that backdrop, Canada's leadership signaled a decisive shift. The announcement was not a single policy change, but a coordinated set of measures that collectively targeted every critical dependency in the American egg supply chain. Restrictions on the export of elite breeding stock and genetic materials were set to take effect within weeks. Feed-grade grain exports were redirected through long-term agreements with partners in Europe and Asia, ensuring that volumes previously sent to the United States would be absorbed elsewhere. Pharmaceutical and veterinary supply contracts were renegotiated to prioritize domestic and allied poultry industries. At the same time, Canada committed billions to expanding its own agricultural processing capacity, aiming to export finished food products rather than raw inputs. Each move addressed a different vulnerability. Together, they formed a comprehensive restructuring of agricultural flows. What made the shift particularly consequential was its timing and preparation. These measures were not improvised reactions, but the visible outcome of months of planning. Trade agreements had already been negotiated, buyers secured, and logistical pathways established before the public announcement. By the time the policy shift became visible, the underlying system had already begun to move. From a strategic standpoint, the declaration was less a beginning than a confirmation that a new framework was already in place. This development reframed the situation beyond a bilateral dispute. The issue was no longer simply about eggs or even agriculture. It became a case study in structural dependency. For decades, the American food system has been optimized for efficiency sourcing inputs where they are cheapest, fastest, and most reliable. That model delivers high productivity and low costs under stable conditions. But it also reduces redundancy. When a key supplier changes course, the system does not gradually adjust. It strains, and in some cases, it fractures. Industry observers and economists often describe this as the trade-off between efficiency and resilience. The more a system is optimized for cost, the more it depends on uninterrupted cooperation. Remove that cooperation, and the absence of backup pathways becomes visible immediately. The egg industry illustrates this dynamic with unusual clarity because its supply chain is both highly specialized and difficult to replicate quickly. Genetics programs take years to build. Pharmaceutical production requires regulatory approval and infrastructure. Feed supply depends on agricultural cycles that cannot be accelerated on demand. The domestic consequences appear first at the consumer level. Eggs are a staple product, but they are also a foundational ingredient in a wide range of foods. When their price rises, the effect cascades through bakeries, restaurants, packaged goods, and institutional food systems like schools and hospitals. The impact is not abstract. It shows up directly in grocery bills, menu prices, and household budgets. Because of that visibility, food prices tend to carry disproportionate political and economic weight compared to other indicators. At the same time, the situation highlights a broader structural question. How many other sectors operate with similar single points of failure? The same efficiency-driven logic that shaped agriculture has influenced manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and critical resource supply chains. In each case, the absence of redundancy can remain invisible for years until a disruption forces it into view. Internationally, such disruptions tend to accelerate realignment. When supply chains shift, countries seek alternatives, diversify partnerships, and reduce reliance on any single route or intermediary. Over time, these adjustments can reshape trade patterns in ways that persist long after the initial crisis has passed. What begins as a sector-specific disruption can evolve into a wider reconfiguration of economic relationships. Ultimately, the situation underscores a fundamental principle of complex systems. Dependencies that seem stable during periods of cooperation can become vulnerabilities during periods of tension. The challenge is not only to respond to immediate disruptions, but to decide how much redundancy, diversification, and domestic capacity are necessary to prevent similar risks in the future. The egg industry, in this context, is less an isolated case than a highly visible example of a broader design question: how to balance efficiency with resilience in systems that underpin everyday life.